I barely had time to glance around when everything around me started spinning as if in a mad vortex, the night sky whipped by a cold wind, the rustling of branches scraping against the trail, and a sudden, almost deafening silence that came at the very moment I realized a tiger was lurking just a few steps away. And it wasn't just a tiger, it was something filled with a primordial rage and fierce, scorching hatred. For an instant, my heart practically stopped. I understood that in this moment, everything was at stake. From now on, any wrong move, any sound, any shift in the air might be the last mistake after which I'd have no chance to escape. I felt my legs weaken, and at that same instant, a survival instinct flared within me. I woke up to a dull thump, as if something heavy had fallen a few steps away. A second later, the entire forest was filled with a sharp, bristling silence unique to wild woods before a storm. My eyes opened, but I didn't immediately recognize where I was. My mind, still foggy from sleep, slowly pieced together the scene: a dark forest thicket, cold ground beneath me, and memories of having been lost for a day during a hike, still trying to reach people. Somewhere behind me, according to my rough estimates, lay the river I had barely managed to swim across at night. The pain in my shoulder reminded me of how I'd crashed into underwater rocks. An inner dread told me that whatever caused that dull sound was no coincidence. I had a strong feeling I wasn't alone in the forest, and that not alone definitely didn't mean some friendly companion. Maybe it was an animal, a fleeting movement that had sharpened my senses. Or maybe I'd just dreamt it in a nightmare. But my heart had already started pounding as if urged on by a whip. I lay half in darkness under the low branches of a thick fir tree I'd chosen the evening before as a sleeping spot. At least it offered me some shelter from the rain. Not that I'd counted on a peaceful night, too many events had crashed down on me in the past day. But my exhausted body demanded rest, and I passed out until dawn. Now, in the pre-dawn gloom, I could scarcely make out the outlines of tree trunks. I wasn't sure if I was ready for another dash. My shoulder hurt, my legs were aching from trekking over rugged terrain, and my head still throbbed from the cold and stress. But staying put meant leaving myself at the mercy of the forest's inhabitants. Gritting my teeth, I lifted myself up and slowly crawled out from under the fir branches, trying not to jostle the wet boughs so as not to make extra noise. My damp clothes clung to my body, a fine drizzle fell from the sky, though in places the canopy offered some protection. I had neither a lighter nor matches. I'd lost almost everything when I fell into the river. I did have a tiny bottle of antiseptic I'd somehow managed to save in the fall, along with a folding knife that hadn't slipped out of my pocket by some miracle. I clung tightly to that knife, as if it could be a decisive factor if I encountered a predator. Again I paused, listening for the source of the thud that woke me. The forest seemed to have swallowed every noise except for the dull rustle of rain and the quiet creaking of trees under gusts of wind. But the gnawing sense of alarm wouldn't let go. I knew a tiger roamed somewhere in this forest, the same one many locals called rabid. Rumor had it that it had been spotted near riverside villages, displaying signs of that terrible disease, unafraid of people, attacking both livestock and hunters. I hadn't expected to meet a tiger in these parts. I hadn't really believed it was truly rabid. But now, after last night, I was no longer certain of anything. I stepped cautiously, feeling the ground with each step so as not to snap any twigs underfoot. Low brush tugged at my ripped pant leg, tearing it further. Every few seconds I paused to listen. But aside from the distant hooting of birds, there was nothing suspicious. Maybe I was just spooking myself, and there had been no thud, or a branch had fallen. An hour ago, right before I finally passed out, I'd noticed heavy clouds gathering again. Rain isn't the best weather for navigation, but it still beats a foggy night. I knew one thing: I had to find a way to civilization. At dawn there was at least some visibility, and maybe I could orient myself by the terrain. Somewhere around here, if I hadn't totally lost my bearings, there should be a hunter's trail that led to a broader clearing. From there, according to the notes in my now waterlogged notebook, you could reach an old ranger station that might still be manned. Failing that, maybe there'd be supplies left there, ammunition, food. Though I had no idea if the station was still in operation. But to get there, I first had to cross that stretch of forest the locals referred to as protected. I gave a wry grin. Protected means hunting was supposedly off limits and wildlife was abundant. A tiger could easily live there. And yet I had to keep going. It filled me with dread to wander through the beast's territory, especially since I knew it existed and was no mere rumor. The mere fact that I survived its pursuit last night was already a stroke of luck. Maybe the rushing river had kept the predator from continuing the chase. But there was no guarantee it hadn't found a way around and wasn't waiting for me around the next bend. Absolutely none. So I pressed on, occasionally wondering, should I call out? Maybe there's a ranger or hiker nearby. But that could attract the wrong kind of attention, and running into the tiger face to face. Even armed with a knife, I stood no chance in a direct fight. Every fiber of my being screamed, "Don't make a sound." So I continued on silently, clinging to my self-control. My shoulder ached, it was difficult to raise my left arm, but I had to move. Slowly morning advanced, and a pale light started to filter through gaps in the canopy. The ground squelched with mud, clearly there'd been intense rainfall overnight, but by now I'd grown numb to it all. I just walked. If I could have stopped to build a fire, dried my clothes, warmed up. But that was far too dangerous. Smoke and scents might attract the beast, or else some gang of poachers. Rumor had it black hunters sometimes roamed around, setting traps and shooting anything that moved. On the trunk of a nearby tree I spotted deep scratches. Fresh ones. Like something had been honing its claws. I froze, peering closely. The scratches were at chest height and continued higher up. I ran a finger along one groove, the bark looked almost slashed open. This had to be the work of a large predator. A bear will sometimes mark trees, but those are typically more ragged, whereas these parallel lines had a lethal elegance, like the swipe of a big cat's claws. "Tiger," I murmured. The question was whether these marks had been left yesterday or a week ago. My feet carried me onward, away from that spot. Raindrops dripped off overhanging branches, sliding down my collar. I longed for warmth and hot tea, briefly recalling how recently I had been sitting around the campfire with friends, joking, teasing one another. How carelessly we had decided a few days ago to try a new route. How everything went south once night fell, the downpour began, and we heard those horrible screams. I lost sight of my companions, maybe they escaped, maybe someone got hurt. I shook my head, forcing out the memory. If I let myself wallow in self-pity or despair, I'd be done for. After passing through a zone of fallen trees, I reached a more level area. The ground rose in gentle waves, and here and there large stone boulders stuck out of the turf. I decided to veer slightly to the right to gain higher ground, that way I might get a decent view of the surroundings. Climbing, I braced myself on trunks so I wouldn't slip. My shoulder flared with a stabbing pain. I felt as though I'd been through a meat grinder, every muscle ached, my head spun from lack of rest and stress. Yet adrenaline still coursed through my veins, preventing me from collapsing. A bird hooted overhead, making me jump so violently I almost slipped off the wet rocks. I again looked around and realized that soon I would be at a vantage point where I might see further. Then I heard the sound I dreaded, a muffled growl or snort, reminiscent of something I'd heard once before. It came from somewhere off to the side, maybe 50 meters away beyond a small clump of trees. I froze, like a rabbit in front of a wolf, my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. My eyes widened in helpless terror. Another growl, louder this time, angrier. I realized it truly was the tiger, and it was somewhere close. Does it smell me or see me? Raced through my mind. My legs turned to jelly and I immediately crouched down, easing my way towards some bushes to the left, hoping to blend into the terrain. My instincts told me, don't run, don't make noise. If I spook it, it'll definitely attack, and I'm on open ground with no chance. I crept on tiptoe toward a large rock and froze, becoming as motionless as a stone. The growling stopped and the forest returned to a menacing silence. Minutes felt like hours. I was afraid to blink. Far off, something rustled, like a big animal moving through brush. Perhaps the tiger had not noticed me or lost interest. I could have stayed like that forever, but the forest gave me no choice. If I moved and it was still close, it would hear me and pounce. The hammering of my heart thundered in my ears. Every second was torture, yet I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. Maybe 5 minutes passed. Very carefully, I raised my head. Nothing in sight, just dripping branches and a strip of grey sky above them. No tiger visible, no growling. Maybe it had left. Summoning courage, I began creeping backward, still crouched low. Descending a couple of steps along the slope, I spotted a narrow gully full of tall grass. Possibly I could slip through there unseen. Even if it meant giving up the vantage point, at least I'd be out of sight. Suddenly a branch snapped on my left, as if something heavy had stepped on a dry twig. I whipped around and glimpsed a striped figure in the dusk of the trees. I felt a chill in my core. The tiger was about 20 meters away. It wasn't roaring or charging, but stalking, trying to spot or smell me. I managed to make out its large feline face, eyes brimming with ferocity. People say tigers always look bright, but in the dim, overcast forest, its fur seemed dull and grayish-brown, the stripes nonetheless distinctly visible. My heart pounded so fiercely I feared the beast might hear it. I can't run too close, I realized. Very quietly, I lay prone and began crawling toward the gully, praying the thick grass and uneven ground would hide me. Each centimeter tested my endurance. The ground was cold, dampening my clothes as my outstretched hand met roots. Inch by inch, I slipped forward, praying the tiger wouldn't spot the swaying grass. Again there was a twig snapping behind me. As if the animal had moved. I froze, hugging the wet soil, goosebumps prickling my neck. I thought I heard a low snuffling sound, like the cat drawing air through its nose, trying to sniff me out. It felt like certain doom, one more moment and it would spring. My hand fumbled for the knife in my pocket, a pathetic defense, but it was all I had. Suddenly, a harsh noise resounded from the opposite direction, maybe a huge branch fell, or something of the sort, and the tiger let out a louder snarl. I realized those sounds weren't me, so the beast was distracted. Seizing that moment, I shook with fear but crawled another 3 meters toward the gully and practically tumbled in, as though diving into thick grass and soggy ground. I grabbed some roots to keep from making noise, breathing heavily but keeping my mouth shut. For a minute or two, I heard heavy footfalls and muffled growling above. The tiger apparently headed the other way, investigating whatever fell. That was my salvation. But I couldn't linger, or it might return. Trying to be as silent as possible, I made my way downstream in the gully, hoping it would carry me farther from danger. Grass and low shrubs scratched my face, but they concealed my body. I felt as though I was crossing a minefield. The gully was longer than I'd anticipated and sometimes deepened into sheer earthen walls. I had to scramble up the slippery slopes, sliding in the mud, catching on roots. Somewhere in the distance I heard faint thunder, likely more rain was coming. That might be a blessing in disguise, muffling my steps and washing away my scent, or perhaps the downpour would just make my trek even more difficult. Eventually the gully opened into a small marshy area. I caught a whiff of stagnant water and saw a patch of scummy pond with reeds and sedges along the edges. I had to tread carefully so as not to sink into the bog. But at least large predators rarely walked into swamps. Then again, a rabid tiger might go anywhere. I gingerly hopped from one clump to the next. Once, my leg sank up to my knee in the sticky muck. I nearly cried out in shock but stifled it just in time. I quietly yanked my foot out, coated in slime, and continued. Every moment was saturated with fear. Somewhere, maybe a few hundred meters away, was that beast that, by all appearances, wouldn't give up. Its hearing and sight were better than mine, and presumably it wasn't afraid of either rain or marshes. My one hope was to move in a way that confused it, to lose my scent in this damp environment. I wondered if the forest would be drier on the other side of the swamp, maybe letting me move faster. Once across the wetlands, I found a firmer bit of ground where tall aspens grew. The ground here was covered in fallen leaves, soft, but prone to crunching. I stepped carefully, sometimes hearing the unwelcome sound of brittle leaves snapping underfoot. Clenching my jaw, I tried stepping on my toes or on exposed roots. Rain indeed fell harder, with thunder rumbling somewhere above. A lightning bolt flashed in the distance, but here in the lower forest everything was veiled in bleak autumn haze. The air smelled of ozone, mixed with the damp smell of wet leaves. Suddenly a bright lightning flash illuminated a gap among the trees, letting me spot movement some 20 meters away. Something darted among the trunks. I didn't see stripes, but my heart lurched in panic. It could be the tiger. Or maybe a deer or a boar. In this forest, any shape might appear. I froze, waiting for the next peal of thunder and flash. Nothing appeared. Maybe the creature left. I decided that standing there was too risky and forged on, though every nerve in my body rebelled. What if the tiger's waiting just behind that trunk? Barely 10 steps later, I heard a sound behind me that made my heart sink, a low, deep growl sliding into a roar. It was there. The tiger must have spotted or smelled me. I realized the showdown was coming. Do I run or hide? One wrong move and it would pounce. Remembering my past experiences where running was my only option, I resolved to do so again, despite knowing the cat could outrun me in a forest. But at least the trees were closer together, their trunks and limbs might hinder its chase. Mustering my last energy, I sprinted forward. The noise of thunder and lightning worked in my favor, masking my pounding footsteps. Behind me I heard the tiger snorting, brush cracking under its heavy paws, which terrified me. If I looked back, I'd likely freeze in horror. I had to focus on the path so I didn't fall. Each step caused a jolt of pain in my wounded shoulder. I could barely swing my left arm. But adrenaline drove me forward. A branch lashed across my face and wind and rain blinded me. Droplets cascaded off the tree limbs, prickling my skin. But the tiger was still close. Its snarling grew louder, some deep, guttural sound. I started thinking it wasn't running full tilt but merely trailing me, waiting. A crazy thought flickered, it's toying with me like a cat with a mouse, staying close enough so I can't fully escape, but not killing me outright, wearing me down so I collapse. Thunder boomed overhead, another lightning strike lit up the forest, and I caught sight to my left of a huge tree trunk the storm had toppled. Its canopy formed a thicket of branches and leaves, something like a barricade. Should I climb up there? Flickered through my mind. No guarantee the tiger wouldn't follow, but if I could wedge myself amid the spiny branches, maybe it'd be harder for the beast to reach me. It was a desperate chance, better than just running aimlessly. I made a sharp pivot to the fallen trunk. My boots skidded on wet leaves, but I somehow stayed upright and dove under the tangle of limbs. Twigs clawed at my face and shoulders like sharp talons, but I pressed on, grabbing whatever handholds I could. Behind me, the tiger roared in fury, apparently realizing I'd changed tactics. Perhaps it couldn't slow down in time or tried charging straight in, because I heard branches cracking and the entire canopy shook. Huddled within that tangle, I saw the tiger lunge past a mere 2 meters away, slamming into the spiny branches. In the lightning's glare, its eyes looked almost demonic, glowing with a mad red tint, its face contorted by snarls. The animal tried to follow me inside, but the snag of limbs slowed it down. An enormous paw swiped near my face and I jerked away, narrowly avoiding contact. My heart was ready to burst. The tiger jerked again and I glimpsed its bared fangs and drooling muzzle. I noticed the animal's abnormal salivation, a sure sign of disease. Possibly rabies had made it so aggressive and irrational. It didn't retreat despite the branches scratching its own face and flanks. Yet I knew that if it found a gap or forced its way through, it would reach me. I couldn't stay put long. At one point, thunder cracked so loudly that the beast seemed momentarily distracted, giving me the time to scramble to a different opening. Crawling on all fours, scratching my arms, I burst out the side of the fallen tree, then sped off among a thicket of young birches. Behind me came a furious roar, clearly the tiger had spotted my move. I ran headlong, heedless of my path, through mud and lashing rain. My hands shook, my shoulder was on fire, and it felt like I'd collapse at any second. But the knowledge that a rabid tiger was chasing me kept me running. Between bolts of lightning and thunderclaps, I could hear my own ragged sobs of terror and exhaustion. I can't remember how long I ran like that, maybe a minute or two, or perhaps an eternity. At last I burst into a clearing overgrown with weeds and bushes. I tore across it, glimpsing a rocky ledge on the far side. Perhaps there was shelter there. I bashed my way into the bushes, stumbled, and fell hard, injuring my bad shoulder. My vision darkened for a second and I nearly blacked out, but the thought, "It'll finish me now," forced me to stand. Crashing sounds came from behind, but the tiger's roar seemed to have died away, maybe drowned out by the thunder and rain, or maybe it got caught in the brush. That gave me a few precious seconds. I sprinted forward, tearing through the undergrowth, until I hit a damp rock face about 3 or 4 meters high. A cliff extended along the clearing, acting like a natural barrier. I hurried along its base, searching for any crack or indentation where I could hide. To my enormous relief, I found a small grotto, almost invisible among the smooth grey rock. Without delay, I wedged myself inside, checking to see if it went deep enough. It was basically an expanded fissure about 2 meters in. Above hung a ledge of stone and some plant roots. Water trickled down the walls, but it was still drier than outside in the pouring rain. The crucial part was that the opening was narrow enough that a tiger would have a hard time crawling in. I ran my hands over the walls, hoping that if fortune favored me, the animal wouldn't be able to force its way in, giving me a chance to rest. Only then did I realize how hard I was breathing, how fiercely my heart was pounding in my chest. I huddled as far into the grotto as possible, crouching to avoid being seen from the entrance. Water slid down my back, and dirt tasted bitter on my tongue. I heard thunder booming and the rain pounding the forest, which somewhere out there still contained that nightmarish tiger. If it smelled me and tried to enter, I'd be trapped. I wouldn't even be able to run. Yet what other options did I have? Dashing out into its claws would be suicide. I must have stayed like that for about 10 minutes, straining to hear over the din of the downpour, afraid to move. My shoulder throbbed, my side ached, my head reeled. My ears still rang with the frantic beat of my heart. I mentally replayed the events of the last hour, the chase, the fallen tree, the claws, the snarling jaws. I imagined how, if someone looked at me then, they'd see eyes inflamed with terror, a face barely recognizable. Finally, my heartbeat steadied a little. The rain eased and the thunder drifted away. I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to quell my trembling. Okay, I told myself, you're alive, that's the main thing. Now what? Am I going to sit here till nightfall, or what if the tiger's outside waiting? I cautiously peered out as far as the grotto allowed. The sky was still dark with storm clouds, but the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The clearing in front of the rock looked deserted. Huge puddles lay in pools where raging torrents of water had gouged the earth. No sign of the predator nor any other living thing. But I knew it was no guarantee. Still, I had to move. My stomach hurt with hunger, my strength was nearly gone. If I don't take the risk, I'll die here from starvation or an infected wound. So, inch by inch, I emerged from the grotto. I crouched, scanning the clearing, nothing in sight, no hint of stripes. The forest stood eerily silent. I needed to find a path, maybe a sign of human presence. I headed to the right, keeping close to the stone wall so I could quickly duck into a hiding place if necessary. After about 20 meters, the cliff dropped and gave way to a high ledge beyond which lay relatively level ground covered in ferns. Maybe that led to the river or a forest edge. My legs quivered as I walked, forcing myself forward. Each step reminded me how wild this forest was, how it sheltered a top predator grown more fearsome by disease. I tried to reassure myself that the downpour had washed away my scent, that the tiger had used up its energy and might be off elsewhere in the forest. But deep down I suspected that monster wouldn't rest until it had its prey. I had met its gaze once already. Crouching behind a tall boulder, I paused to listen. All I heard was raindrops and a faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. A thought flashed, maybe it's gone and I'm shaking for nothing. But then I recalled how effortlessly that striped huntress had vaulted from tree to tree. No, it's too soon to relax. Stealthily I made my way across another clearing and went back under the canopy. Here the trees were sparser, the grass lower, so I could speed up a bit. Sometimes I felt maybe I'd finally lost the beast for good. But soon I spotted flattened grass and paw prints in the moist soil. Huge. Fresh. Apparently the tiger had passed through here not long ago. If it wasn't just circling, it might be moving the same direction I was. That thought almost threw me into panic, but I rallied and pressed on. Before long, the terrain started sloping downward, presumably toward the river. If I reached the bank, maybe I'd find a place to cross or a fisherman's shack. That might be my salvation. At the very least, water was often associated with people, and perhaps the tiger disliked open areas as much. Though, ironically, I'd already tried crossing a river once and nearly drowned. The memory didn't inspire confidence. After about half a kilometer, I heard the subdued rush of water in the otherwise quiet forest. Sounded like a stream or small rapids. My heart eased a bit, water could help erase my trail, and maybe I'd find fishermen. Pushing forward, I entered a stand of slender birches and aspens, but once again felt a prickle of danger. I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze, raising my knife, laughably, my only weapon, flattening myself against a birch trunk. Silence, just the patter of raindrops. But 15 meters away, behind a bush, 2 points of yellowish glow appeared, the tiger's eyes. Time seemed to stop. I felt as if the beast was staring straight through me. But the tiger didn't leap that very second, it hesitated, possibly unsure of what it had seen. I took half a step back, trembling, and a stick I was leaning on snapped beneath my foot. That was enough. The tiger sprang forward with a roar, and I, without thinking, dove sideways. Another frantic chase in the forest labyrinth had begun. Though the land here was more level, mud had turned the ground into a slippery trap. The guttural snarls behind me melded with the roar of rainfall. Had I been less exhausted, maybe I could have run faster. As it was, my body was running on fumes. I was pinning my hopes on the river once again. Maybe there'd be a fallen log bridging it, making the tiger reluctant to follow, or maybe I'd have a chance to dive in. Desperately I raced toward the sound of rushing water, paying no attention to the rest. Wet brush whipped my face, and behind me, somewhere, bounded that rabid predator, occasionally roaring so loudly I felt my insides clench. At last, the land flattened out by the river bank, which was thick with reeds. The water roared more strongly, meaning it was a fairly big river. Gasping for breath, I burst from the forest and found myself before a fast-flowing, churning torrent. The heavy rain had obviously raised the water level. No bridge, no ford. But I didn't dare look back, the tiger was right behind me. Frantically, I ran along the bank, scanning for a fallen tree or at least stepping stones. A gravelly snarl came from behind, and I knew the beast had reached the bank and was readying a leap. I whipped around for a moment and saw the striped form skulking among the reeds. Panic seized me, and I waded into the frigid water, hoping it wasn't too deep. First up to my knees, then my waist, the current tugged at my legs. Another second of horrifying clarity, tigers can swim, can't they? But I had no choice. I went in deeper. The river raged, and I saw large rocks forming rapids a few meters ahead. If I could somehow cross, I might escape. Meanwhile, the tiger emerged from the reeds, crouching low and preparing to spring. The current yanked me off my feet. I couldn't swim well in these conditions, but the beast gave a short growl and launched into the water, sending up a huge spray. I screamed in terror, realizing it wasn't afraid of the torrent. Waves slapped against me as I struggled not to be swept away. With frantic strokes, I fought to reach the far shore. The water was icy, cramps seized my legs. I heard splashes behind me, the tiger was swimming, but the current was likely carrying it away too. Maybe that was my only hope. Forcing every ounce of strength, I tried to keep afloat, swallowing equal parts water and air, drifting downstream. I mostly used one arm because my injured shoulder barely moved. At one point, the current slammed me into a submerged boulder, nearly making me black out from pain. Another wave tore me free, and I resumed thrashing about. None of it felt real. I used to believe my biggest life fears were exams, relationships, maybe career hiccups. But those seemed laughable now, with a rabid tiger chasing me for its kill. After shooting through a tumultuous stretch, I sensed the current easing a bit. The left bank looked closer. Summoning my last dregs of strength, I swam that way, my feet not yet touching the bottom but trying to push on. Soon the bottom turned silty but firmer. I spotted some driftwood snagged near the bank. Coughing and spitting out muddy water, I clutched at it. I crawled ashore, collapsing face down in the mud. My eyes stung, my body burned with bruises and cuts. The first thing I did was turn back to scan for the tiger. In the downpour and swirling currents, I saw no sign of it. Possibly it was carried further downstream, or maybe it clambered out higher up the bank. In any event, it wasn't here now. Shaking, I dragged myself under some nearby bushes. I had almost no strength left, my heart hammered, and I could barely breathe. I'd survived, but for how long? Shivers racked my body, a wave of panic returning, what if it comes out of the water here, like a nightmare? But moment after moment, no one emerged. And for the first time in hours, a faint spark of hope flickered, maybe I'd finally shaken that hellish beast, at least for now. I closed my eyes, feeling the cold rain still pelting me, river water dripping off my lips with a gritty, silted taste. In my mind's eye I still saw the bared tiger fangs promising death. Yet I lay on the opposite bank, still alive. Despite the shoulder throbbing with pain, I heard no roars behind me. I should rest just a few minutes, I told myself, then search for help. Someone around here might rescue me. At the same time, I knew I couldn't really afford to relax. If the tiger truly had rabies, it might fear nothing, even crossing calmer stretches of the river. I had no idea how much time I had. But at that moment, my brain shut down from overload, and I slipped into a daze with a single last wish that this nightmare would finally end. I don't know how long I lay there, half unconscious, half dreaming. Perhaps a minute, maybe an hour. The cold seeped into my bones, while midday rain turned to a drizzle softly settling on leaves and grass. When I came fully to my senses, I realized any slight movement brought dull pain, my shoulder wound throbbed, my chest felt battered as if from a blow, and a stabbing pain gripped my side every time I inhaled. Still, I was alive. My first impulse was to jerk my head up to peer behind me. The riverbank lay empty, reeds swaying in the breeze. No sign of the tiger. Maybe it was swept away or found its way out further upstream or downstream and lost me. Yet I harbored no illusions. The beast had already proven how relentless it was, especially in its insanity. If it hadn't drowned in the rapids, it might be circling around to pick up my trail once more. I had to leave. If I remained here in a daze at the water's edge, I'd have no defense if the tiger showed up. Collecting myself bit by bit was difficult. I was frozen, drenched, nearly spent. But dread of the beast's return forced me onward. I forced myself to move, though my legs nearly gave out from weakness. For a moment I thought I wouldn't be able to stand. But I gritted my teeth, braced my knee, and rose unsteadily, almost swaying sideways. The sky above was sullen and grey, a few feeble rays of dull sunlight piercing the clouds, indicating midday was passing. My mouth tasted of river water and blood, apparently I'd bitten my lip or tongue while thrashing in the current. Silence rang in my ears, broken only by the river's soft murmur and leaves rustling in the wind. I scanned the heavy brush near the bank, half expecting to see that striped shape appear. But it didn't. Wincing, I made my way along the shore, trying to put distance between me and the spot where I emerged from the water, hoping the soft, rain-soaked ground would mask my footprints. I aimed uphill toward the forest, maybe to find a trail leading to a village or at least an abandoned hut. I badly needed shelter to dress my wound and somehow warm up. Judging by the state of my body, I didn't have much time. Using a piece of driftwood as a walking stick, I hobbled diagonally up the slope, each step making my heart pound. Every so often I paused to catch my breath and listen. All around me was damp and quiet, perhaps because of the downpour scaring off most forest creatures, or maybe they were lying low. Suddenly a twig snapped somewhere, making me jump and stagger forward a step. But it was just a small deer that bolted from the bushes and vanished deeper in the woods. My heart lurched painfully, any sudden movement I now associated with the tiger. When I'd climbed about 50 meters from the river, I turned back to survey the bank. A dense line of vegetation concealed it. From here, I could no longer see the water's edge, only glimpses of grey current and sparse bushes. If the tiger was lurking below, it likely couldn't spot me instantly. Maybe I had a slight head start. With that thought, I pressed further into the forest, keeping to higher ground. This land was steep, cut by terraces of young aspen. I waded through wet branches, looking for anything that might be a trail. At one point, I came across the remnants of an old fishing net tangled among the brush. That got me thinking, if fishermen once came here, maybe there's a hunting cabin nearby. Or a derelict shack, at least. Step by step, I moved farther from the river until I found an area full of tall ferns and scattered pines. The ground here was drier, letting me pick up my pace slightly. My spirit wanted nothing more than to get away from the water, though it saved me. That river now symbolized another close call. I was exhausted from battling both nature's fury and the tiger. I was desperate for any hint of human presence. The swath of ferns stretched on until I spotted something resembling a faint trail, a narrow lane of pressed-down plants and patches of stone showing footprints. Possibly old footprints, but human nonetheless. My heart gave a jump. There it is. Checking around for any sign of the predator and finding only ancient tracks, I decided to follow it. I walked cautiously. My arm, numb and painful, was almost useless, but I forced myself forward. Keep going. If there's a trail, there's hope of reaching people. Don't give up. I stumbled now and then on the slick path, with exposed pine roots forming awkward steps. but it beat trudging aimlessly through thick undergrowth. At one bend in the trail, I was seized by a coughing fit, likely the onset of hypothermia. I wanted to stop, but then the thought of the tiger, possibly hearing me, spurred me on. I pressed my hand over my mouth to smother the coughs and eased down onto a wet stone beside the path. My head spun. Exhaustion weighed on me so heavily I feared I wouldn't survive without some warmth or shelter. Even lighting a fire in this rain, though, seemed nearly impossible with no dry fuel. I looked around hopefully for any sign of a shelter or a cluster of spruce that might be drier. All I saw was ferns, pines, and sodden grass. Overhead, branches swayed in the breeze, dropping rivulets of water. The downpour might have slowed, but I was still drenched. Again, I felt how helpless a person is in the wild with no gear, especially when a perfect natural killer is stalking you. When my coughing eased, I pressed on along the trail, halting occasionally to listen for that familiar roar. Nothing. Even the birds had gone silent, except for a few distant crows. Eventually, I realized the trail began descending again, possibly toward a different stream or ravine. I had no desire to turn back. For the first time, a faint hope that the tiger might have lost me flickered. But I couldn't be sure. The slope got steeper, the trail partly vanishing in thick bushes, then reappearing. My legs started trembling with fatigue. At one point, a fallen log blocked my path. Trying to climb over it, I found I had no strength left. I scrambled awkwardly, nearly toppling sideways. The jolt reactivated the pain in my shoulder, darkness danced in my vision. For several seconds, I stood gasping, blinking away dizziness. My hearing became hypersensitive, anticipating the tiger's stealthy steps. But the forest remained quiet. After plodding along, head swimming, I came to a small hollow. A stream burbled below, and near its bank I glimpsed a silhouette I first mistook for another fallen tree. Stepping closer, I realized it was a small log cabin or shed, half sunk into the ground. Its roof had mostly collapsed, but the walls still stood, leaning precariously. Shelter popped into my head. I hurried toward that ruin as best I could, noticing one wall had caved in and the other was overgrown with moss. It looked truly abandoned, but maybe it offered some protection from wind and drizzle. Entering, I picked my way through crumbling boards and saw there was indeed a patch of roof covering a meter or two of space. The floor was littered with rotted wood and decaying leaves, and in one corner lay what looked like old straw or hay, darkened by damp. The odor of mold and rot nearly made me gag, but it was still better than sitting out in the open rain. If the roof didn't leak too badly, I might at least dry some of my clothes and catch my breath. Summoning my strength, I kicked aside wet debris and squeezed in, trying not to crash through the rotten floor. It was cramped, but I found a spot where the boards held me, then leaned against a wall. My heart still pounded, my throat burned from coughing. Every breath felt like a small victory. I tilted my head back, closed my eyes, giving my weary body a brief respite from non-stop fear. My mind drifted to my friends. Where were they now? Were they safe? Had they escaped? Or would I be haunted by the memory of one of them falling victim to this tiger? I recalled the cries and our panicked flight. Tears threatened, but I just clenched my fists, cursing my own powerlessness. A gust of wind rattled the remaining rafters, sending bits of debris raining down on me. The air reeked of damp decay worse than ever. Resolving to scout the place more thoroughly, I wondered if there might be anything I could use, rope, rags, anything at all. I found only rotten scraps of wood and boards half turned to mulch. A rusted hook protruded from one wall, perhaps once used for hanging tools or bundles of herbs. Still, it was drier here than outside, shielded somewhat from wind. I realized that, loathsome as it looked and smelled, this place might save my life if I waited an hour or two to rest. Would I risk spending the night here? Hard to say. If the tiger caught my scent, it could easily tear through the flimsy wall. But I was so weak I could barely stand. Resolving to at least treat my wound, I peeled back my wet clothing. The fabric clung to my skin, making me hiss in pain as I pulled it away. A dark bruise covered part of my shoulder, and a shallow cut ran across it, likely from bashing into a rock. The blood had caked over, but I worried about infection, especially after exposure to river water. I had to rinse it somehow. Glancing around, I noticed a puddle of rainwater in a corner where it had dripped through the broken roof. It was murky, full of soggy leaves, but still water. Soon I retrieved the small bottle of antiseptic from my pocket, the only item from my hiking kit that had survived. My hands shook as I unscrewed the cap. I put a couple drops of antiseptic on my fingers, mixed it with the rainwater in my cupped hand, and gently washed the wound. The pain was excruciating, like a hot iron searing my skin. I bit my lip to keep from screaming, afraid the noise would draw the tiger or some other predator. When I finally finished, I tore a strip from my already shredded shirt and fashioned a crude bandage to cover it. I probably looked pitiful, but had little choice. Then I slumped into the rotted straw and tried to settle so I wouldn't sink further in. The stench was revolting, but I scarcely cared at that point. My eyes kept sliding shut from fatigue. Don't fall asleep, I warned myself, but your body needs the rest. I spent 5 minutes fighting off drowsiness, keeping an ear out for any sounds outside. If the tiger came, I might hear twigs snapping or a low growl. Though it could just sneak up without a sound. That thought sent shivers through me. I also realized that in this dim space, my imagination could easily turn any noise into something terrifying. But exhaustion weighed heavily and my consciousness soon dipped into a half-dream haze. Eventually, I drifted off, my head lolling on my chest. Rapid flashes of the chase haunted my dreams, fangs in the darkness, the roaring river. I dreamt I was sitting at a campfire with friends, only for a giant tiger to emerge from the trees and sit beside me like a pet cat, but with crazed eyes. I tried to shout, but no sound came out. My actual awakening was abrupt. I jolted to the real-world sound of a sharp click near the entrance. My heart again thundered in my chest. Almost silently, I got to my feet, ignoring the spike of pain, my knife at the ready. I looked around to see the battered door, or what was left of it, slightly ajar, though I couldn't recall how I'd left it. The wind. Or was someone there? Holding my breath, I strained to catch the slightest movement. Through a gap in the collapsed wall, I saw wet grass and bushes, rustling softly. Perhaps just the breeze. But that click had resembled the snap of a twig beneath a heavy foot or paw. I froze. Silence. Only my labored heartbeat and the dripping roof. No growls, no sign of a large predator. Even so, I peered out, unwilling to move. If the tiger stood outside, it could pounce at any moment. Then came a faint swish, as if footsteps hurriedly crossing wet grass, then nothing. Briefly, I considered I might have dreamt it, that the wind had jostled the boards. But no, my instincts insisted something had been nearby. Maybe it was just an animal passing by, a wild boar or deer. If it were the tiger, it likely would have attacked already. I forced myself to believe the danger had passed. Nevertheless, I realized I couldn't stay here long. The trail to this shack was too obvious. If an animal or person was out there, they might wander in. I had few resources to defend myself. Though the short rest had partially restored my breathing, I was still far from fully recuperated. I ached all over, my head buzzed, I was freezing and stressed. But deep down, a voice shouted I had to move on. Gently opening the door, I slipped outside. A blast of chilly air hit my face, though at least the rain had mostly tapered off. Only stray droplets fell from branches. Judging by the dim light, the sun was sinking behind thick clouds. The forest took on a damp twilight glow. If I didn't hurry, nighttime would trap me here in a worse predicament. Skirting the little shack, I checked the ground. No fresh paw prints in the mud except for my own and maybe a faint hoof print. So probably a deer or something else had startled me. Some relief, though my fear lingered. I recalled the trail that had brought me here and decided to keep following it. It was better to keep going than to spend a night in this moldy den. Leaving that precarious roof behind, I couldn't help but picture the next stop as possibly my last. My strength was minimal and it felt like I was running a fever. I began to shiver. The thought of a rabid tiger discovering me in this shack at night made my hair stand on end. No, better to chance the trail. It descended steeply to a small creek. I eased down carefully, praying I wouldn't slip. The creek's gentle babble accompanied floating brown leaves. I scooped up some icy water and splashed my face, rinsing away grime. I took a couple of sips, hoping I wouldn't catch something. At this point, what did I have to lose? The tang of iron lingered in my mouth. Continuing along the creek for 100 meters, I came upon a fork. The path curved right, and to the left were some partially submerged rocks. I guessed right might lead into lower terrain, maybe a small village rumored by the local campsite staff. No clue where left led, maybe deeper into wilderness. I turned right, still praying my sense of direction was correct and that I'd find some settlement. Here and there are past old fire rings, stones in a circle, charred logs. People had clearly camped or hunted here once, perhaps in spring or summer. Now, abandoned in off-season rains. Still, the mere fact that others had built campfires gave me hope, maybe folks lived or stopped nearby. I'd welcome any human presence, even poachers or rangers likely wouldn't shoot me on sight if I explained my plight. As I followed that faint track, night began to close in. The canopy around me darkened, the trees took on ominous shapes. Every time a branch brushed my shirt, I flinched, fearing a tiger's paw. How desperately I longed for a warm house, a lamp's glow, hot tea. Reality spared no mercy. I was alone, injured, and nearly spent in a savage forest. The path rolled up and down. Eventually, I noticed what looked like a post or sign among the trees. My heart leapt with excitement. If it was a sign or boundary marker, maybe people weren't far. I hurried over, using the last of my strength. It was indeed a wooden post, badly rotted and leaning. No readable lettering remained, the rains or time had obliterated it. Nonetheless, the ground around it was compacted, evidence it had once been significant, with a path continuing on. Scanning the area, I saw a side trail leading away, somewhat straighter and possibly cleared long ago. I decided to go that way. A breeze whistled through the pines overhead, making me shiver. Dusk was rapidly descending. If I didn't find secure shelter soon, I might be forced to light a fire under a tree, thereby risking the tiger's attention. But if I didn't warm up, I might not survive the night. I could feel a fever rising. Staggering on, I suddenly glimpsed a roof or covering through the trunks. Perhaps an outdoor shed or storehouse. Joy soared within me anew. I pushed forward, half stumbling. Indeed, a few minutes later I reached a small clearing with a wooden cabin, sporting a peaked roof, though weathered. Its windows were dark, possibly boarded up. A wooden platform with rough benches stood near it, with a rusty metal barrel off to one side. I paused at the clearing's edge, hardly believing this stroke of luck. I had to be sure no unfriendly occupant, man or beast, lurked inside. I crouched to look. The house seemed deserted, no smoke, no lights, no sounds. The door appeared sturdy, it might be locked. I crept across the open ground, peering into the windows. Some glass had shattered, others were barricaded with planks. With utmost caution, I climbed the short steps to the porch, the boards creaking. I tried the door, locked. My heart sank. Was it all for nothing? Next to the door I noticed a sturdy wooden latch, presumably locked from inside. From outside, though, I might lift or slide it free if it wasn't rusted shut. I grabbed it, yanked once, twice. With a screech, it gave way. I pushed the door, and it swung open with protesting hinges. A musty odor greeted me, not as sickening as the old shack, more like dust and damp. I stepped into a dim interior. The room was small, about 7 or 8 meters across. On the right stood a metal table piled with tin cans, some empty, others sealed and dusty. To the left, I made out a large iron stove or heater. At the far end was another door. The floor was wooden, partly rotten, but sturdier than that previous hovel. Softly shutting the door behind me, I slid the latch back in place. From the inside, there was a substantial iron bolt. Testing it, I managed to lock it, though it squeaked. Now, if the tiger arrived, at least I had some barricade. Mentally thanking my luck, I leaned against the wall, nearly sliding to the floor in weakness. Summoning my remaining willpower, I approached what looked like a stove. Yes, an old iron heater, partially covered with metal sheets and venting into the ceiling. A pile of rotten kindling lay on top, presumably left as fuel. With luck, I might be able to start a fire. Feeling around, I found an old metal scoop, a moldering broom, a few stones that might have been used to hold the stove door shut. Damn it, I whispered, a surge of hopeful excitement rising in me. If the stove still worked, I could warm up, dry out, and hide behind these walls. True, they might not be fortress thick, but better than sleeping outside in the open. I scanned the room. In one corner stood some rotting crates containing scraps of cloth that smelled of mice. On the metal table I found a couple of tin cans labeled with half-peeled wrappers and rust. Possibly old can meat, though it might be decades out of date. Another can rattled with dried bits, maybe grain or peas. Likely spoiled long ago. I decided to tackle the fire first. While there was still enough light, I had to see if the stove could be lit. I gathered all potentially burnable material, the slightly less rotten scraps around the stove, splinters from the crates, the driest shards, plus any paper I found in a drawer, some pages damp but not fully soaked. Also a little piece of cloth, friction might help as tinder, but I had no lighter or matches. Mine were lost in the river, and a flint and steel approach was beyond me. I spent a few minutes staring blankly at the pile, realizing there was no way to start it without a spark. My hopes dimmed. Perhaps I could rummage for a stray flint or something left by hunters. Probably not. I dug deeper into the crates, all junk, old corks, rags, broken knives. But in one corner, I felt a small tin box. Opening it, I discovered a few shotgun shells and a pack of matches. My hands shook with excitement. I pulled them out. The pack was damp, covered in patches of mildew. Useless. Carefully, I slid out a match, struck it against the side. Nothing. The moisture likely ruined it. I kept trying. On the fourth attempt, I got a brief hiss and a tiny spark that died instantly, possibly from my breath. That meant not all was lost. I took a deep breath, pulled out a fifth match, more gently this time. A small flame sparked. I held it to some dry splinters, paper, and cloth, trying to coax a tiny flame. The paper smoldered, sending up a wisp of smoke. I carefully added thin splints, blowing softly. My heart thumped wildly. It's catching, it's catching. I exulted mentally. Soon, the cloth began to burn. I transferred everything into the stove, gradually adding shards of wood. Smoke filled the small space, making me choke, but we had fire. That was all that mattered. The stove, surprisingly, still drew fairly well, so not all the smoke stayed in the room. I carefully fed in bits of wood. After so long wandering in the cold, terrified, it was practically a miracle to see a living flame. Before long, I'd built a small but steady fire, warmth spreading through the room. It felt like bliss beyond compare. I scooted closer, peeling off my soggy outerwear, trying not to fully strip in case someone or something burst in. My shoulder was still bandaged, which I loosened a bit so it could at least dry. Splinters crackled in the flames. The smell of smoke and decay permeated the air, but it was infinitely better than freezing. I tried wringing water from my hair, thinking that a cup of tea or broth would be the greatest gift imaginable. But I was stuck with just the stove. A wave of dizziness swept me. My strength was almost gone. Once that cozy heat enveloped me, I wanted to lie right down on the floor and pass out. But I kept checking the door and window, worried I'd hear roaring or footsteps outside. The tiger might approach if it smelled smoke. Or perhaps other people. How would they react to an intruder in their cabin? I could only hope it was disused or that the owners would understand my plight. Stretching my hands to the fire, I relished every moment of warmth. My body trembled, torn between a sense of relief and the lingering chill. I coughed at intervals, my throat felt raw as though I'd inhaled live coals. It gurgled in my chest, as if I might have pneumonia or something similar. And please not rabies, I thought grimly. At least it never bit me. Unless it scratched me without me noticing. Then again, rabies doesn't develop that quickly. I shook off the thought, focusing on the flame's comfort. Sometimes I heard the wind gust down the chimney. Outside, darkness settled fully and the firelight flickered against the walls. I realized night had come, so I had to stay. It was probably the best option anyway. Here, I had a locked door and a fire that could scare off animals. Still, the idea of sleeping deeply frightened me, not knowing what might happen if I let my guard down. Before completely succumbing to exhaustion, I decided to check the back room. Gently opening the inner door, I discovered a short hallway and a second, smaller space, where a rotting wooden bunk stood. Possibly the cabin's sleeping area. In a far corner crouched a trunk under a tarp, littered with debris and cobwebs. I removed the cloth, brushed off dust, and tried lifting the lid. The hinges were rusty, but eventually relented. Inside lay cloth sacks, reeking of old age. One was half full of some dried grass or hay, mostly decayed. Another contained a few bundles which turned out to be old canvas bags that might serve as a makeshift blanket. Gratefully, I grabbed one. It was moldy and damp, but still thicker than my torn jacket. In a corner, something metallic glinted. Reaching in, I pulled out a small metal flask or canteen. There was liquid inside. Water or liquor? I wondered. Warily unscrewing the top, I sniffed. It smelled pungent, reminiscent of homemade moonshine or some strong spirit. Maybe left behind by hunters for the cold. I recalled tales of locals storing alcohol for injuries, or as an antiseptic, or just to ward off chills. Whatever it was, it might be a godsend. I took a cautious sip. The liquid burned my throat and tongue, causing a coughing fit, but I recognized the taste of alcohol. Not too foul, apparently not spoiled, fairly strong. A spreading warmth filled my body. I suspected that drinking might be unwise in my condition, risking deep sleep or less vigilance. But a small swallow or two might help me fight off shivers. Gathering the flask and the canvas, I returned to the main room where the stove glowed. Tossing a couple more scraps of wood in, I was rewarded by a hungry flicker of flames. Then I spread out one of the canvas sheets near the heat, not too close, so it wouldn't catch fire, and collapsed onto it. My fever seemed to be rising. I took another tiny swig from the flask, capping it and placing it aside. I wasn't sure how much longer I could endure my condition. But at least I had warmth for the night and some degree of safety. Casting a glance at the door, the bolt was in place. If the tiger tried battering it down, at least I'd hear it. Maybe I could scare it off with noise or brandish burning logs. Rabid or not, animals often fear fire. Drowsiness overcame me, my head spun, my body cried out for rest. Should I risk sleeping? If I didn't, by tomorrow I'd be utterly useless. I added a couple more broken slats to the stove and curled up, arms around my shoulders, on the canvas sheet. Half closing my eyes, I watched the flames dance in the stove. Flickering shadows played across the walls, highlighting rusty cans and battered crates. The smell of smoke intermingled with the damp, though a strange coziness enveloped me. Let the night pass without trouble, I thought, my eyes sliding shut. So many hours of terror and cold hammered me into a deep slumber. I dreamt that the door suddenly creaked open to reveal a flaming red eye of the tiger. It watched me like an executioner over a victim. I was paralyzed, unable even to lift a hand. The animal crouched low, poised to spring. I tried to scream, but my throat seized in a mute spasm. Then a white flash, a gunshot or lightning bolt, shattered the nightmare, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I opened my eyes to find the stove nearly burnt out, only glowing embers remaining. The room was cloaked in gloom, it must be deep in the night. My heart pounded, but the door was closed, no sign of forced entry. I lay there, panting, wondering how long I'd slept. Judging by the embers, maybe an hour or two. My forehead burned, fever creeping higher. Coughing seized me, and I clamped a hand over my mouth not to wake the forest. No moonlight seeped in through the boarded windows, perhaps the moon was hidden by clouds. The silence was overwhelming. I sat up, coughing, drenched in sweat. I had to build the fire back up or freeze. Even moving felt like wearing chains, each motion cost me enormous effort. My hand trembled as I rummaged for leftover wood. I found a few pieces, broke them up, shoved them in the stove. I had only a handful of matches left, and lighting them was no small task. Luckily, the embers weren't completely dead. Fanning them gently, I coaxed out some sparks. Adding little chips and blowing lightly, I ignited a tiny flame that spread to the scraps. Soon the stove gave off warmth again, calming me slightly. I fetched the flask near my makeshift bed and took one scorching sip to steady my mind. Suddenly a wave of chills struck me again, my temperature must be soaring, my body flipping between heat and cold. Fatigue tried to drag me under once more, but I feared a second round of nightmares. If the tiger had found my hiding place, it could appear at any moment, and I wasn't strong enough to defend myself. My eyelids drooped uncontrollably, though. I'll just sit by the stove, I told myself, leaning against the wall. Through half-lidded eyes, I watched the shadows flickering. The bolt on the door rattled faintly, perhaps from the wind, or maybe I imagined it. I jerked awake, looking sharply around. Silence again. The same heavy silence. Hallucinations, illusions, I thought, realizing fever can play tricks on the mind. I lost track of how many times I dozed off then startled awake. Once or twice, loud coughing fits roused me, other times, the floor creaked under me. Each time, darkness and eerie quiet reigned. Eventually, I opened my eyes to see a faint grayness through a crack near the window. Dawn must be breaking. I listened for birdsong. None. Possibly the forest was still gloomed and overcast. Yet I felt a faint lift. I'd survived another night, battered though I was in this decaying cabin. Now fully conscious, I coughed violently, hugging myself until the spasms passed. Leaning against the stove, I saw the coals were nearly gone, no more fuel to maintain it. I'd either have to scavenge more wood or resign myself to letting it die. I doubted I had energy for a search. But I knew I had to move. If I lingered, the tiger, if still around, might catch my scent or stumble across me. I also needed to find civilization before my fever or injuries killed me. Slowly, I got to my feet. The room was a somber twilight. I moved to the window, pried off a couple of planks, and peered outside. I saw silhouettes of trees, a drizzle continuing. A dense mist lay on the ground. I had to decide whether to set off now or wait for full daylight. Weighing the options, daylight would help me see the trail, but if the tiger was near, it might also see me more easily. Then again, a rabid tiger might attack at any time. Better to go than remain here. Besides, I was starving, and the only potential food were those suspicious old cans. I probably had a long road ahead. I whispered a goodbye to the stove, silently thanking it for that night's warmth. I grabbed the flask, checking its contents. A small bit of liquid remained. It might still help. I tucked the matches into an inner pocket to keep them dry. Who knew if I might need them again? The leftover shotgun shells stayed behind. With no gun, they were pointless unless I somehow extracted their powder for fire starting. Deciding it wasn't worth the trouble, I let them be. Steeling myself, I inhaled deeply. I was still feverish but at least more stable than before. My shoulder ached, though the bleeding had stopped. I tried rebandaging it more snugly with rags from the trunk. A rough job, but better than nothing. At last, I stepped to the door, slid the bolt free, heart pounding at the thought, what if the tiger's waiting? But there was no turning back. Slowly I opened the door and peered out. Fog shrouded everything, obscuring the distant trees. Ahead, the clearing and field I'd crossed the previous day looked quiet and damp. I crept onto the porch, careful not to let the boards creak. A glance all around, nothing but mist and wet grass. The rain had nearly stopped. I strained my ears for steps, snarls, or snapping branches. Nothing. Maybe the tiger had gone far away, or maybe it had died. I had no way to know. Summoning the last of my courage, I descended the steps, scanning around. From this angle, the little house looked more decrepit than ever. Off to one side lay a stack of old logs, sodden and worthless. Staying put was out of the question. Choosing the opposite direction from where I'd come, I began walking, hoping to stumble across a path or some vestige of humanity. After maybe 30 meters, I glanced back at the cabin. It loomed in the mist like a ghostly shape in the forest. I felt a faint gratitude for it. It had sheltered me through the night. A fragile hope glowed in me that now I might truly survive. But I was also aware I might face more dangers. If the tiger hadn't drowned, it could still be roaming, and I was burned out with fever and fatigue. Just let me find people, I whispered as I trudged on through the sodden grass. Another day in this perilous forest awaited me, but retreat was not an option. My will to live was stronger than my fear. So I left behind that old hunting cabin, stepping into the misty morning. Glancing back at the place I'd passed the night, I felt a bitter anxiety yet also a faint spark of hope. And though the tiger hadn't reappeared, its phantom still loomed in my thoughts, haunting me with every rustle in the thick undergrowth. I froze in place, feeling cold sweat on my back. When we read stories of predators silently stalking their prey, it always seems like some distant reality, far from our everyday comforts. But standing there on that barely visible forest path, I grasped how real it all was. The tiger that stared at me from the dark was the embodiment of our deepest, most ancient fears. And it wasn't an ordinary tiger. Its eyes glowed with a reddish light, at least as I perceived by moonlight. Its behavior was unpredictable, and the rumbling that emanated from the tall grass sounded like a trembling, angry vibration, ready at any moment to erupt into a furious roar. At that second, hearing the menacing growl, instinct spurred me to move. I dashed toward the path, hoping perhaps the tiger wouldn't bother to chase if I withdrew quickly enough. But such hope was a mirage. A feeling deep in my psyche warned that the beast had chosen me as its target and wouldn't relent until it appeased its savage, insane lust for the hunt. At least that's how I felt, as though some inner alarm screamed that this wasn't mere curiosity on the tiger's part, but a single-minded, murderous rage. I remember the night wind whistling in my ears as I bolted downhill, trying both to be silent and to move as fast as possible. Sticks and leaves crackled underfoot, each snap making my heart pound all the harder. I was running from a creature nature had crafted to be the perfect predator. And this was no normal tiger. It looked rabid, judging by its fierce eyes and dark, frothing saliva glinting in the moonlight. Its eyes shone with fury, and its movements were erratic and twitchy, symptoms of agonizing illness. Yet that seemed to only heighten its power. Its speed and agility were inconceivable. Within seconds of me bolting, I heard a solid thump behind me. The tiger had leapt with unexpected strength, its paws hammering the ground close by. Another fraction of a second and it would have knocked me down. The rending of dense undergrowth under its bulk sounded like cracking bones, a terror so overwhelming I couldn't immediately process it. Paralyzed by panic, I fled faster, nearly slipping on mossy stones in the half-light. I keenly understood a single misstep could end my struggle for life. In the mountains, a winding trail could drop off a cliff or corner me in a dead end. The stones might slip out from under me. This mad flight was a gambler's bet with death. Every action was fueled by frenzied adrenaline. I felt no exhaustion, though my heart pounded so hard it threatened to burst from my chest. One thought pulsed incessantly: don't stop. Don't look back. Keep your pace. Survive at any cost. Underfoot, the terrain alternated between steep descents and abrupt rises. Ducking beneath low-hanging branches, I scratched my arms and face, ignoring the pain. Occasionally I realized I was half-sobbing or uttering strangled gasps. Fear whipped me like a lash. Once I dared a glance over my shoulder and glimpsed only a dark blur hurtling after me, nearly silent. The tiger never lagged. Its shape flickered like a nightmare incarnate, unstoppable. Disappearing into shadow, then reappearing, each time I thought, this is it. It'll leap now. Branches overhead suddenly swayed, and fat raindrops began slashing through the air on the cold wind. I realized storm clouds had gathered, thunder rumbled somewhere distant. A lightning flash briefly illuminated the tiger's silhouette, huge muscles, head hunched low, ears pinned back. I imagined it roared so loudly the heavens shook, though perhaps that was my overfed imagination. Despite my terror and how close it was, a strange resolve stirred in me. Perhaps pure survival instinct, or some deeper primal will. I started thinking about where to run, where to hide, which route would avoid trapping me. But I recognized that with the tiger so near, I stood little chance of ducking behind a fallen trunk or a rock. My one option was to run non-stop toward the river. Perhaps a raging torrent would be a barrier to the beast. Each breath scalded my throat, my lungs seeming on fire. I kept losing my footing on slick rocks and roots, my heart stopping each time. This is it, I'm done. By some miracle, I managed to keep from falling. Behind me, I heard threshing vegetation and that haunting snarling, like the animal wanted to drive me further into terror. I was perilously close to losing my wits, but it was unthinkable to slow down. It had only been a few minutes, though it felt endless. I emerged onto a slightly smoother slope, hoping to pick up speed. Then I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the tiger leap over a fallen trunk as if stepping over a twig, still on my tail. That moment I realized how vulnerable I was. If it truly wanted to overtake me, it could. Likely it was playing a game, letting me cling to the faint hope of escape before crushing my throat. Soon I heard the murmur of water. My heart hammered beyond belief, my nerves pulled taut as wires. If I reached the bank, my only plan was to jump in. I'm not skilled at swimming mountain rivers, but what else? The tiger was right behind me, seconds from sinking its fangs into my flesh, so the only alternative was the churning water. Better to risk drowning than be ripped apart. Hearing its ragged snarls nearly at my back, I poured on the last reserves of speed. In the stormy darkness and drizzling rain, I descended a steep slope to the rocky riverside. A flash of lightning let me see the fierce current surging in places over rapids. Panic seized me at the thought of jumping, but the tiger was almost upon me. By moonlight, I saw its blazing eyes, filled with bloodlust, frothing jaws. In a final desperate move, I hurled myself into the water. The icy torrent flipped me, water rushing into my mouth as I gasped. Waves engulfed me, knocking me off my feet, dragging me across sharp stones. My limbs flailed, my sense of control vanishing. But better to brave the icy depths than be devoured alive. I wasn't sure if the tiger followed or stayed ashore. My mind was clouded by terror, wholly focused on not drowning. The raging current hurled me against the rocks, spun me in whirlpools. Eventually, I surfaced, gulping for air. My feet found no bottom. The current was too strong. I felt the last scraps of my energy slipping away. Still, fear of death is a fierce motivator. Some half-buried voice in my mind roared, "Live. Don't give up." At one point, I latched onto a jutting branch, only for the flow to rip me away again. Water thundered in my ears, I saw only darkness, whipping waves, had no sense of time. Suddenly the torrent seemed to ease slightly, maybe a calmer stretch. I managed to come up for air and saw a snagged limb on the left bank. Summoning my last ounce of strength, I paddled desperately for it, hoping to drag myself ashore. One more surge, I grabbed the branch. My waterlogged clothes pulled me down, but I clung with all my might. Slipping and sliding, I somehow hoisted myself onto a small, stony ledge. I lay there, breathing raggedly, completely soaked. My chest felt crushed in a vice, pain and exhaustion weighed on me. But the worst terror had receded momentarily. Evidently the tiger hadn't jumped after me, or else the current had swept it away too fast. I have no idea how long I remained sprawled there. Maybe a few minutes, maybe much longer. Each breath brought coughing, and my mouth tasted brackish river water. I was chilled to the bone. Far off, thunder still grumbled, lightning flickered, and the rain's steady drumbeat continued on leaves, the shore, on me. But I was alive, which for that moment felt like a miracle. I closed my eyes, trying to gather myself to decide my next move. Staying by the water spelled hypothermia or another encounter with the beast if it found a detour. I had to push on, find any shelter. But I had almost no energy left. I tried standing, bracing with my arm, and felt a searing pain in my shoulder, likely from slamming against the river rocks. My arm wouldn't obey, giving way, so I fell back into the mud. Shakily, I got up, nearly crying out from agony, and forced myself along the bank. I had to go as far from that crossing as I could, though the storm, darkness, and fatigue made navigation hard. Eventually, stumbling through brambles and stones, I found a gentler stretch of bank with fewer trees. I realized I couldn't go much farther. Every muscle shook with strain, every cut throbbed, the cold bit my skin. Spotting a rocky overhang or boulder that might give me cover from the rain, I crawled toward it, sobbing with relief. Collapsing, I felt sleep dragging me under so strongly I couldn't resist. My eyes shut on their own, and I fell into a fitful half-sleep riddled with nightmares, the tiger on my trail in the dark, strobing lightning, screams that might have been my own. No idea how long I lay there. When consciousness returned, the downpour had eased to a feeble drizzle. The night sky remained overcast and sullen, but a faint lighter hue in the east signaled dawn wasn't far off. I panted, head throbbing, shoulder aching. I was still alive, which amazed me. I shook my head a few times to clear it. The tiger, might it still be near? Would it dare to cross the river? No answers. Shivering uncontrollably, I knew I had to act. I couldn't stay under that rock. Summoning my will, I forced myself upright despite a spike of pain in my shoulder. I needed to push on, though with the storm and no compass, I could only guess a settlement lay upstream. My memory felt hazy, but it was my only plan. Teeth chattering and legs quaking, I set off downstream, keeping away from the water's edge so as not to fall in again. Each passing minute my senses seemed sharper, I heard every rustle, jumpy at the possibility of the tiger reappearing. What if it's already here on this side, sniffing out my blood? The thought raised goosebumps, but I reminded myself that crossing such a raging river at night might not appeal to even a rabid animal. Even if it had braved it, I still had no other option. I trudged on, fighting both pain and the desire to simply collapse and let the forest decide my fate. Survival instinct drove me. Eventually, as the forest started to lighten, I realized the shapes of trees were becoming more distinct. Reaching a small clearing where the ground felt softer after the storm, I heard a distant bird call. The sound might as well have been angelic. It meant the night was ending, day was coming. Yet with that meager dawn returned a sense of dread. The tiger could hunt just as effectively in daylight, and I was too weak to defend myself. My best hope was to find people or some hideaway, or climb somewhere the tiger couldn't reach. But I recalled tigers can climb or conceal themselves in rocky dens if they wish, and a diseased one likely feels no fear or fatigue. I decided to keep following the river in search of any sign of human life. Perhaps a bridge, a trail to the base camp from which we'd set out. I had lost track of my friends, uncertain if they survived. The thought twisted my guts. All I could do was hope they heard the tiger's roars and got away, or perhaps found help in a nearby village. Relying on that was foolish. So I stumbled on in near delirium, barely able to stay upright, heading farther along the bank. From time to time, I glanced across the river, looking for signs of a pursuing tiger. But the water churned with silt, roiling from the night's deluge. I spotted a lone heron by the shore, a pale silhouette in the morning fog. As I neared, it flapped off with a noisy clatter. My heart lurched for a moment, expecting a striped ambush, but nothing happened. After perhaps half an hour that felt like hours, I realized the bank was rising into a cliff. I had to climb some rocky outcrops or risk a dead end. Scrambling upward, I slipped multiple times on wet stones. My shoulder throbbed fiercely, apparently seeping blood again. My clothes were in tatters and I trembled with cold. A hammering headache reminded me, I need shelter or I'll never make it. Eventually I reached a fairly level plateau overgrown with bushes and trees. Forcing aside the branches, I glimpsed what might be a clearing or old track in the distance. A surge of hope rose. Quietly, I moved forward, scanning all around in fear the tiger might spring from anywhere. But I had no choice, onward I went, slow but determined. The closer I got to that clearing, the more obvious it appeared these were man-made signs, trees cut, logs scattered. Maybe an outpost or a ranger's shack, I thought, heart pounding. If I could find a building or a living person, I might be saved, plus warn others about the rabid tiger. I pressed through the brush, trying to make out any structure. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me, as though a large creature was following. My blood froze, I spun around. No one there, just trembling leaves in the faint dawn glow. But that sense of being stalked returned with a vengeance. Possibly my imagination, but possibly the tiger on my trail. My heart thundered so loudly it nearly drowned out my thoughts. I edged sideways, hugging a large tree trunk, breathing heavily like I'd just sprinted. Don't panic, don't scream, I muttered internally. If it's here, it'll leap the moment it sees me. I scanned the vegetation, but swirling fog in the weak sunlight played tricks. Shadows danced, and I couldn't be sure whether stripes lurked there. Mustering courage, I decided, standing here is suicidal. I have to move, reach people or at least better shelter. Low to the ground, I made for the clearing. My shoulder stung with every step, my temple throbbed. I recalled that rabies erases an animal's caution but leaves it with its raw power and reflexes intact. A rabid tiger is a half-insane killing machine, unafraid of anything. At last, I reached the clearing's edge, discovering what looked like a narrow trail. Yes, definitely a path, though overgrown. Maybe it led to some deserted lodge or storehouse. With caution, I started walking it, avoiding noise. My mind still roiled with panic. My heart hammered like a caged bird. Deep down I felt mortal peril lingered. All I could do was hope the tiger had lost my track or found alternative prey. A harsh thought, but the selfish drive to survive overshadowed my compassion. Through dense brush, the trail continued, at times hidden under fallen branches or tall grass. I stayed near the center, trying not to snag on thorns or rustle leaves. I was nearing total exhaustion, my body seemingly weighed down by pain. I also worried that my shoulder wound could become severely infected without proper care. Where would I find supplies or even basic bandages? Unexpectedly, the path bent, leading to a small stream. It gurgled softly, cutting across my route. The banks were muddy, with logs forming a makeshift bridge. I crossed carefully, sliding on the slick wood. I cupped my hands for a drink, ignoring how stale it tasted. I was that desperate. I didn't know if I even had the stamina to continue. Which way to go? Was there any real chance? Barely on my feet, I suddenly heard a sound that made me freeze, a low, raspy snarl from somewhere on the left. I went cold, straining my eyes among the trunks but only seeing shifting leaves in the breeze. My mind raced, maybe it's not the tiger, maybe a boar or something else, but my gut told me otherwise, that it was the beast. Possibly it had returned. Possibly it had tracked me all along. I could have tried to remain silent. The next second, though, I thought I saw a red glint of eyes among the foliage, maybe just a trick of the light. Torn between bolting and risking an immediate attack, I broke. Adrenaline propelled me forward down the trail, as fast as my battered legs allowed. I might have screamed, half from pain, half from despair. I scrambled, dodging branches, all but numb to my body. With each step, I imagined claws raking my back. After about 100 meters, I realized I'd forgotten all stealth and was crashing through the undergrowth. I halted, pressing myself against a large trunk to catch my breath. Silence fell again, only the last raindrops pattering. Maybe the tiger wasn't there, or maybe I'd outrun it. No going back. I had to keep moving until I found some real refuge or escaped this cursed forest. By now, dawn had strengthened and the fog was lifting. I trudged on, stumbling often, until the trees thinned out and gave way to a small clearing. Off to one side, beyond thick bushes, a faint glint caught my eye. Could be water, or some sheet of metal. Looking closer, I realized it was a sheet metal fence, plus broken wood. Maybe a fence or barrier someone had built. My heart clenched with excitement. Could that mean a sign of human habitation? I decided to risk it. Circling the bush, I discovered an old yard with a rickety metal fence, half-collapsed gate. Perfectly abandoned. I lifted the sagging gate, peering in. A small building stood inside, probably a shed or guard's hut. A wave of fatigue and tension washed over me. This place might be my salvation or might be empty. Either way, it provided potential shelter. Carefully stepping into the yard, I listened. Silence. The hut's door hung ajar. Inside was dim, smelling of rotten wood and mold. No obvious sign of animals or inhabitants. Probably deserted years ago. The floor was intact enough, and I saw old blankets or sacking. For me, soaked, wounded, freezing, it felt like a godsend. I staggered in, propping the door from inside though there was no latch. Among the boards, sacks, and general debris, I found a fairly dry patch. Using them to dry off a bit, I sank down, hugging my knees. My shoulder throbbed, and I gingerly touched the wound to see if it was bleeding. Possibly it had clotted, though my shirt was soaked red, and I lacked a proper dressing. But at least resting here might save me from collapsing out there, I told myself. Overhead, something rustled, maybe rats or birds nesting in the rafters. I ignored it, breathing deeply to calm my mind. The terrifying question surfaced again, what if the tiger followed me here? The fear was so intense I listened for every noise outside, expecting a heavy tread or a snarl. Still, time passed without any sign. Eventually, the tension mingled with exhaustion, and my eyelids drooped. My last coherent thought was that I'd doze a bit before deciding my next step. Apparently I did pass out. When I opened my eyes, the daylight outside was brighter, and I heard a piece of tin squeaking in the breeze. Sitting up, I felt an ache in every joint. But the short rest had done me some good. My mind was clearer, if I don't move on, I'll stay here forever. I have to try to find a path to people, perhaps a country road or something. Using a stick as a makeshift cane, I peered through a gap in the boards. It was quiet, no beast or human. My lips were parched. So much time since I'd fled the river. It felt like an eternity. And I still needed enough strength to keep going. I sighed, scanned the shed for anything useful, a rope, water jug, anything. Found only rusty nails, a few planks, some ancient crate. Next to worthless. I accepted that reality. Resolutely, I opened the door and stepped into the sun. The day was now in full swing, though the sun hid behind the clouds. The forest behind the fence swayed in the wind. If the tiger was out there, I couldn't see it. I had to keep going. The gate squealed loudly as I forced it open, sending an uneasy chill down my spine. If the tiger is near, it'll hear that. But staying was pointless. I emerged onto an overgrown dirt track, presumably once used for hauling supplies or something. It stretched south, by my guess, while I believed my base camp was somewhere to the southeast. Perhaps I'd intercept a route I'd once hiked with friends. Step by step, I inched away from the battered fence, still glancing around. Silence, broken by wind and occasional bird calls. My nerves remained on edge, anticipating an attack at any moment. I stuck to the middle of the road, hoping to spot danger from the sides. My shoulder throbbed, but I'd grown used to the pain as though it were part of me. Periodically, I paused to scoop up rainwater from puddles, ignoring the questionable cleanliness. Staying hydrated was crucial. And so I trudged for maybe an hour or more. Eventually, I reached what must once have been a crossroads. One path dipped right, another climbed left. The sign nailed to a tree had long since rotted, unreadable. I stood there, torn, when I heard a faint crack behind me. Spinning around, I saw nothing, but my pulse spiked. Possibly just the wind snapping a branch, or maybe I was being followed. I took 2 steps left, then froze. Something inside me suggested going right, back to the river, might lead to a settlement. But the banks were steep, could hamper me. The uphill forest might be even wilder. I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, then heard another twig snap behind me, louder. No more time to think. I chose the right-hand path and walked as fast as I could. With every step, that eerie feeling grew, as if a large creature trailed me, keeping to the shadows. I spotted no footprints, but sometimes I heard subtle rustles or crackles. Repeatedly I turned my head, scanning, but tree trunks and undergrowth blocked my view. I tried to calm myself, might be just a deer, but my memory of the tiger devoured any reassurance. My heart pounded, my muscles shook. Another encounter like last night would finish me. After about half an hour, the trail brought me to a cliff. Below, the river wound more peacefully, fringed with reeds and willows. In the distance, a hazy outline of the mountains from which I'd tumbled. How far I've come, I thought, shoulders slumping in exhaustion. But where now? Possibly I could climb down and follow the river. What if it's a dead end? As I mulled this, a jarring snarl, louder than before, echoed behind me. I froze. The sound came from the forest, distorted and unnatural. No doubt it was the tiger. Then it hit me, it had indeed tracked me all this time, denying me any chance to rest. It might have followed my scent or simply felt my presence. Pure panic exploded in my head, run now. But a cliff loomed ahead, a wild beast behind. My only option was along the rim, searching desperately for a slope or path. Finally I spied a narrow slope choked with brush. Possibly I could scramble down to the river or find a boat. Anything was better than letting the tiger corner me on open ground. Without more thought, I slid down the slope, grabbing at bushes. The clay surface was slick, and I half fell, half crawled, scraping through thorns. My heart hammered, breath ragged. Soon I emerged by the river, muddy water lapping a stony bank. Off to the left rose a dense bank of willow. To the right, I suddenly saw a human figure. Some distance away stood a man with his back to me, maybe wearing outdoorsy gear, a fisherman or hunter. I couldn't believe my eyes. A choke of relief rose in my throat, salvation. But I hadn't taken 2 steps when I heard crashing behind me and a ferocious roar. The tiger was descending the slope. I screamed for help, running toward the man, waving frantically. He spun around, startled, leveling a rifle. I managed to shout something about tiger and help, pointing behind me. At that moment, a striped shape burst from the bushes, ignoring its injuries or exhaustion, locked on me. The stranger grasped the situation instantly. He aimed and fired at the beast, the gunshot echoing deafeningly off the rocky bank. I collapsed to my knees, overcome by fear and relief. In my blurred vision, the tiger roared in pain, the man yelled for me to get up, and he fired another shot, driving the creature back. I saw it vanish into thick brush, maybe wounded or just stunned. That gave us our opening. The man grabbed my arm, helping me stand despite my semi-conscious daze, my heart brimming with gratitude. "Let's move," he barked. "There's a cabin not far from here. We'll be safe." I was too drained to feel my legs, but recognized this as my only chance. The tiger wouldn't let go if it was still alive. "Rabid beasts don't stop," my inner voice stated. Yet I saw determination in the stranger's eyes. He wouldn't abandon me. I took a faltering step, knowing any second I could collapse. But he pulled me along, heading upriver. Behind us came a warning snarl. A jolt of adrenaline let me run a few more steps. We rounded a bend in the riverbank, coming upon a small wooden hut with a slanted roof. The man tore open the door, half dragging me inside. I heard him bar the door with a sturdy beam and ready more shells. It was dark in there, smelled of smoke and leather. My heart hammered so wildly I couldn't catch my breath. But between me and the beast now stood wooden walls and a man who knew how to shoot. "Catch your breath," he said. "Name's Dmitri. I know these parts, but I'd only heard rumors of a rabid tiger. Guess they are true." I tried replying but only coughed a hoarse sound. I shook with cold and terror, sliding to the floor, leaning against the wall. Everything blurred: pain, tension, relief. The single fact was that I was still alive and no longer alone. Maybe we could fend off the tiger or outsmart it to reach safety. But the memory of this night, a chase steeped in fear, would stay with me forever.